Lieutenant John Carter stood at the edge of the docking bay, staring at the sleek alien ship that had just arrived. It was a historical moment, the first official collaboration between humanity and the Reneri. The alien species had been trying to contact Earth for years, and now, after months of negotiations, the day had finally arrived. John had been chosen as part of the engineering team to maintain the human side of the mission, but in truth, he was just happy to be out of the office. John's job was straightforward: fix things when they broke. But what no one had told him was how strange it would be to work with the Reneri. The aliens were tall, their bodies slender and covered in soft blue skin. Their eyes, glowing a soft violet, gave them an otherworldly look. They spoke in a language that seemed musical, but also foreign. John was still getting used to it, and he couldn't help but feel a little uneasy every time he caught one of them looking at him. Kalina, a young Reneri xenobiologist, was part of the delegation assigned to the mission. She was calm and composed, a stark contrast to John's often restless nature. Despite her polite smiles, John could sense her curiosity about humans, as if she were studying him like one of her many experiments. They had exchanged pleasantries, but their interactions had been brief. It was hard to know what to say to an alien. John had never imagined that their first meeting would happen under such circumstances. The alarm blared suddenly, shattering the calm in the docking bay. The sound was so loud it made John's ears ring, and within moments, the room filled with flashing red lights. A high-pitched voice echoed through the speakers. Biohazard breach detected. All personnel must report to the quarantine chambers immediately. Repeat, biohazard breach detected. John's heart skipped a beat. His hand instinctively reached for the emergency radio, but it was too late. The doors sealed shut, and everyone in the docking bay was locked inside. He turned to Kalina. She seemed unfazed, her expression unreadable. "What's happening?" John asked, his voice sharp with concern. Kalina's eyes flickered with something like recognition. "It's not a mistake," she said quietly. "The pathogen may be from our ship. It might be why we were sent here." John's mind raced. He had heard of the risks involved in space travel: alien diseases, unknown viruses, and pathogens that could wipe out entire crews. But this wasn't just any virus. This was something far worse. The thought of being trapped in a chamber with an alien girl and not knowing whether they were safe made John's stomach twist. "How do we handle this?" John asked, trying to remain calm. Kalina didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned toward a nearby console, her fingers moving quickly over the alien interface. She muttered something in Reneri, a soft hum that was too low for John to understand. He glanced at her, then back at the sealed door. "What now?" he asked, more to himself than anyone else. "You stay calm," Kalina replied, glancing at him briefly. "I'll see if I can make contact with the medical team. If this is what I think it is, we might have a serious problem." John wasn't sure if he should be relieved or worried. He had no idea what Kalina was talking about, but the urgency in her voice made his anxiety spike. They weren't alone in the quarantine chamber. Other humans and Reneri crewmates were with them, but no one seemed to have any idea what was happening. The room was silent except for the occasional cough or rustling of uniforms. As time passed, John began to notice something strange. The air in the chamber seemed heavier, almost suffocating. He felt his skin prickle with a growing unease. His breath quickened, and he wiped a hand across his forehead. "You okay?" Kalina asked, glancing up from her work. John nodded, but his stomach twisted. Something was wrong. The air wasn't just thickening, it was changing. It felt almost like something was in the air, watching them. His pulse quickened. "We're going to be fine," Kalina said, more to herself than to him. "We just need to wait until the quarantine protocols finish scanning us." John didn't feel fine. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As the hours passed, he grew more restless. The silence between them stretched longer. Kaylina was still working at the console, her focus absolute, but John was losing patience. He couldn't help it. He had to speak. "How long do you think this will last?" he asked, his voice a little too loud in the stillness of the chamber. Kaylina turned her eyes toward him, her violet gaze sharp. "I don't know. Until the scans are complete," she replied, her tone cool. "But it will take time." John glanced at the walls, feeling the weight of the isolation pressing down on him. The chamber felt smaller with each passing minute. He looked at Kaylina again. It wasn't just the quarantine that had him on edge. It was her presence. The idea of being locked in this tiny space with an alien, someone so different from him, unsettled him in ways he couldn't explain. The last thing John wanted was to be stuck in a room with someone he didn't understand. But it seemed they had no choice now. All they could do was wait, and hope that they weren't too late to fix whatever had gone wrong. John paced back and forth in the small, dimly lit quarantine chamber, the sound of his boots echoing against the cold metal floor. He had always been someone who liked to keep moving, but here, in this confined space with only Kaylina for company, the restlessness seemed to multiply. His thoughts swirled in circles. How had this happened? Why were they locked in this room, with no way of knowing when it would end? And more importantly, why was he stuck with an alien who didn't even seem worried about the situation? Kaylina was at the far side of the room, sitting cross-legged on the floor, her delicate hands working over a series of tools she had scavenged from the quarantine kit. She was calm, methodical, almost as if this were just another day in the lab. John couldn't help but be frustrated by her cool demeanor. She wasn't human. She couldn't understand the anxiety building in his chest. But he had to admit there was something strangely reassuring about her composure. Maybe it was that she seemed to know what she was doing. Maybe it was because, at least in this situation, she seemed to be the one in control. "Do you have any idea what's happening?" John asked, his voice a little sharper than he intended. Kaylina didn't look up from her work. "Not exactly," she replied. "But we are both infected. It's clear that the pathogen has already started interacting with our biology. Your heart rate has increased, and I can see a slight change in your skin color. You're beginning to show symptoms." John's hand instinctively went to his neck. He felt a small pulse under his skin, but he hadn't noticed anything else. The air in the chamber had become thicker, and his breath was faster than normal. He hadn't realized how much it was affecting him until Kaylina mentioned it. "I feel fine," John said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. "I got no idea what you're talking about." "Trust me," Kaylina said, looking up at him with an expression that was as close to serious as he had seen. "You may not feel it yet, but it's there. The pathogen is intelligent. It's adapting. We need to act fast, or we could both be in real trouble." John frowned. He hadn't thought of the situation as being that serious. He had just been trying to survive the boredom. But Kaylina's words carried a weight that made his stomach turn. He had always been good in a crisis, but this wasn't like any crisis he had dealt with before. "We need to figure out how to fix this," he said. "We can't just sit here and wait for things to get worse." Kaylina nodded and stood up, walking toward a small console on the wall. "I'm trying to get a signal to the medical team. But so far, the quarantine systems have blocked any outgoing communications. We're cut off." John's mind raced. They were trapped in this room with no way to contact anyone, no way to even know if anyone knew they were in danger. He could feel the pressure mounting, the isolation threatening to crack his patience. "Can you repair it?" John asked, moving closer to Kaylina. "The communication system, I mean." Kaylina glanced at him, her violet eyes flickering with a hint of recognition. "I'm not sure," she said softly. "The systems are designed to be foolproof. If they detect a biohazard, they lock everything down. I would need to bypass several layers of security to make any progress." John took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. "I've worked with similar systems before. Maybe I can help." Kaylina's expression softened, and for the first time, John saw a glimpse of something other than cold professionalism. "You think you can help?" she asked, her tone slightly teasing. John couldn't help but smirk. "I've been known to get into a few places I'm not supposed to be." Kaylina raised an eyebrow. "Impressive," she said, clearly not expecting him to respond that way. For a brief moment, there was an unspoken understanding between them. It wasn't friendship, not exactly, but there was something. Something that told John they weren't so different after all. They both had a sense of purpose. They both wanted to survive. And for now, that was enough. "All right, let's see what we can do," John said, approaching the console. "If I can get into the system, we might be able to send a signal for help." Kaylina stepped back, giving him space to work. John knelt down beside the panel and began examining the system. He didn't know the alien language that controlled it, but he had an instinct for these kinds of things. He started pulling apart the panel with quick, careful movements, bypassing the first layer of security. It was harder than he thought. Alien technology was nothing like anything he had worked on before, but after a few minutes of trial and error, he got it. "Got it," John said, feeling a rush of satisfaction. "Now let's see if I can send a signal." He worked quickly, inputting a series of commands based on the few human protocols he could make out. Kaylina stood silently by, her eyes studying him in a way that made him uncomfortable. He wasn't used to being watched, but somehow, with Kaylina, it felt different. She wasn't judging him. She was simply observing. After a tense few moments, the console beeped, and a small screen flickered to life. "Message sent," John said, standing up. "We should hear something soon." Kaylina nodded, a small flicker of approval in her eyes. "Good work, John. You've proven yourself useful." For a brief moment, they stood there, neither of them speaking. The room felt quieter, the air less oppressive. They were still trapped, still in danger, but somehow it felt like they had taken the first step toward getting out. The quarantine chamber was quiet, save for the soft hum of the life support system. The walls were cold and smooth, the lights dimming slightly as the hours dragged on. John couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him. He had managed to fix the communication system, but now, with nothing to do but wait, his mind wandered. He felt strange. He couldn't explain it. There was a heaviness in the air, a subtle shift in the way his body responded to the environment. His heart rate had slowed down, but it wasn't the relief he had expected. Instead, it felt like his body was reacting to something else. His skin prickled, a faint, almost electric sensation running through him. Across the room, Kaylina was still working, her attention focused on the small console she had been studying. She hadn't said much since they had sent the signal, but John could tell she was deep in thought. He had noticed the changes in her, too. The way her eyes seemed to flicker with an inner glow, the way she moved with a kind of fluid grace that didn't quite match her calm demeanor. There was something about her now that felt different. He couldn't quite put his finger on it. "Kaylina," John said, his voice steady but with a hint of uncertainty. "I don't feel right. Something's going on." Kaylina's violet eyes turned toward him, sharp and attentive. "What do you mean?" she asked, her tone curious but not alarmed. "I don't know," John said, shaking his head slightly. I don't feel like myself. I can't explain it, but it's like something's inside me, messing with my mind. My body's changing." Kaylina's expression shifted, a flicker of concern passing over her face. She stood up, moving closer to him with careful steps. "Let me take a look," she said, her voice calm yet commanding. John hesitated for a moment but then nodded. He couldn't ignore the strange sensations coursing through him any longer. Kaylina approached, her hands glowing faintly as she scanned him with a small device she had pulled from her pack. It was an alien tool, sleek and smooth, but it didn't seem too different from some of the medical equipment he had seen back on Earth. "Your body temperature is elevated," she murmured, as if talking to herself, "and there's a strange bioelectric charge in your system. It's unlike anything I've seen before." John shivered involuntarily. "Is that Bad. I'm not sure, Kaylina replied, her voice thoughtful. But it's clear that the pathogen is affecting us more than I thought. It's not just a biological infection. It seems to be interacting with our nervous systems, altering the way we think and feel. John's stomach twisted with worry. So it's not just making me sick. It's changing who I am. Kaylina nodded slowly, her face serious. I think so. The pathogen seems to be an adaptive life form. It interacts with its host in ways that enhance certain biological processes, physical and mental. It could be trying to bond with us, making us more efficient, more attuned to each other. John felt his heart race again. The thought of an alien pathogen bonding with him was unsettling. He had always thought of himself as in control of his own body, his own mind, but now, with this strange feeling growing inside him, he wasn't sure of anything anymore. Do you feel it too? He asked, his voice quieter than before. He had noticed how Kaylina's behavior had shifted. She had become more focused, more intense in her movements, as though she were becoming one with the situation. But she hadn't said anything about feeling strange. Kaylina's gaze softened, and she nodded. Yes, I feel it as well. The pathogen is working on both of us. It's affecting our minds, our emotions. It's trying to merge us, make us a team, in the truest sense. That sounds terrifying, John muttered, running a hand through his hair. He couldn't even look her in the eye. How was he supposed to trust this alien when everything inside him screamed that something wasn't right? It's not about trust, Kaylina said, as if reading his thoughts. It's about survival. We don't have a choice. The words hit John harder than he expected. Survival. That was the only thing that mattered right now. The pathogen was forcing them into a kind of partnership, a bond that went beyond mere cooperation. It was as if their very biology was being rewritten, intertwined in a way they could neither understand nor control. A deep, uncomfortable silence settled between them, and John could feel the weight of the moment. The air felt thicker now, more oppressive. The small chamber, once a simple holding area, now seemed like a pressure cooker ready to explode. Kaylina returned to her work, but John couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. It wasn't just the pathogen. It was something else, something deeper. The sensation of being observed, of being studied, had grown stronger. It was as though Kaylina was reading him, sensing his every thought and reaction. Do you think this will kill us? John asked quietly, breaking the silence once more. Kaylina didn't look up this time. I don't know, she replied, her voice steady but filled with uncertainty. It's possible, but the pathogen seems to want us alive. It's not killing us, it's changing us. John took a step back, feeling overwhelmed by the weight of her words. He wasn't sure which was worse, the idea of being infected with an alien pathogen that might change him forever, or the unsettling realization that Kaylina, the alien girl, might already know more about him than he did. They were becoming more connected, but John wasn't sure if it was something they could control, or something they had no choice but to accept. The minutes stretched into hours, and John felt like he was in a constant state of anticipation. The weight of the silence pressed on him, thick and suffocating. Every breath he took seemed to come with more effort, as if the very air in the quarantine chamber was working against him. He could feel the strange sensation in his body continuing to grow. His heartbeat was a steady drum in his chest, but it felt more intense than usual, like it was synchronizing with something else. His thoughts were no longer his own. Every time he focused, it was as if something was reaching into his mind, pulling at the edges of his consciousness. Kaylina sat on the other side of the room, absorbed in her work once again. Her delicate hands moved quickly, adjusting the small devices she had been using, her face fixed in concentration. She didn't seem affected by the pressure of the situation, or at least she wasn't showing it. But John had begun to notice subtle changes in her too. Her movements had become more fluid, her expressions less rigid. She seemed calmer, more attuned to the world around her, like she was blending into the environment. John didn't know how to feel about it. He wanted to be frustrated, to shout and demand answers, but he couldn't deny the strange pull he felt toward Kalina. It was as if the pathogen was pushing them closer together, not just physically, but mentally. He could feel her presence in the room, her thoughts drifting toward him, mingling with his own. It was unsettling and disorienting. "Kalina," he said, breaking the silence. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, softer than he intended. "Do you feel that? The way the air feels thicker. It's like something is changing." Kalina glanced up, her violet eyes locking onto his. "I do," she said quietly. "It's the pathogen. It's altering our perception of reality, making us more aware of each other's presence. We're becoming more connected." John swallowed hard. "Connected? You mean like we're sharing thoughts?" "Not exactly," Kalina explained, her voice calm but filled with an unsettling certainty. "It's more like a synchronization. Our minds are syncing up. Our bodies too. The pathogen is encouraging us to become one. It's how it survives." John didn't know how to respond to that. The idea of being mentally connected to Kalina, of being part of her in some way, sent a chill down his spine. He had been alone most of his life. Sure, he'd worked with others, but this was something entirely new. That's a lot to process," John said, rubbing his temples. "I don't know how to deal with this. I've never felt anything like it before." Kalina nodded, her expression softening slightly. "I understand. It's strange for me too. I've never experienced anything like this with another species, but it's happening, whether we're ready for it or not." John couldn't help but glance at her. The calm way she spoke, the way she seemed to accept the situation, only made him feel more unsettled. She was so composed, so in control, and here he was, struggling to keep his mind in one piece. "We're both infected, right?" he asked, trying to find some anchor in the chaos swirling inside him. "But why? Why us? What's the pathogen doing to us?" "It's trying to bond with us," Kalina explained, her voice steady. "The pathogen thrives by merging with its host, blending both biology and consciousness. It seeks to make us more efficient, more connected for survival. In our case, it has chosen to adapt to our specific genetic makeup, creating a bond that is both biological and mental. So we're becoming like partners in this?" John asked, struggling to keep up with the information. Kalina looked at him for a long moment, as if considering his question carefully. "In a way, yes. But it's not about partnership in the way you think. It's about the pathogen using us to evolve. We are becoming more like one organism, connected, intertwined. It's necessary for survival. The pathogen can't exist alone. It needs a host, but it also needs cooperation." John's mind reeled. Cooperation. How could he cooperate with something that was literally changing him? The thought made his stomach twist in knots. And yet, as much as he hated to admit it, there was a part of him that could feel the pull, feel the urge to follow the strange path the pathogen was leading them down. His thoughts were less his own, becoming more and more entwined with Kalina's presence, her every movement and feeling. "How long do we have?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Kalina hesitated before answering. "I don't know. It depends on how quickly the pathogen integrates with our systems. If we resist too much, it could cause severe complications. But if we cooperate, if we let the bond form, we might be able to control it." John's heart skipped a beat. Control it? How could they possibly control something like this? He didn't even know what it was doing to him. But Kalina seemed confident, and that confidence was starting to make him wonder if she knew more than she was letting on. "We have to decide what to do," Kalina said, her voice calm but firm. "If we resist, it will be painful. But if we cooperate, we may be able to use the connection to our advantage. We might be able to escape this quarantine and stop the pathogen from spreading." John stood still, his mind racing. The idea of cooperating with the alien pathogen was terrifying, But the thought of continuing to fight it, of letting it control them, was even worse. He didn't know what the right choice was, but one thing was certain. He couldn't do it alone. "All right," he said, his voice firm now. "Let's figure this out. Together." Kalina gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Together," she agreed. And for the first time since the quarantine began, John felt like there might be a way out. The quiet hum of the life support system was now strangely soothing. The tension that had filled the quarantine chamber earlier seemed to have lessened, replaced by an unspoken understanding between John and Kalina. Despite the strange, growing connection between them, there was a sense of calm in the air. They were no longer just two strangers locked in a small room. They had become something more, partners in this bizarre situation, each feeling the other's presence in ways they couldn't explain. John sat against the far wall, his legs stretched out in front of him. His mind was still buzzing with thoughts, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The pathogen had changed him in ways he couldn't describe. He could feel Kalina's emotions, her thoughts, faintly echoing in his mind, and it made him uneasy. It wasn't just the physical changes he was experiencing. It was the mental ones, too. He had become more aware of her, more attuned to her presence. "You're quiet," Kalina remarked, breaking the silence. She had been sitting across from him, her eyes thoughtful as she watched him. John looked at her, frowning. "Just trying to figure things out," he said, his voice low. "This whole situation it's a lot to take in." Kalina nodded, her violet eyes reflecting a sense of understanding. "I know. It's overwhelming. But we're in this together, and we have to keep moving forward." John sighed, rubbing his temples. "I don't know if I can keep up with all these changes. My body, my mind, it's like I'm not even in control anymore." Kalina's gaze softened. She had seen the strain in John's eyes, the unease in his movements. Despite her calm demeanor, she understood the difficulty of what they were going through. The pathogen was working on them both, making them more connected, but also making them lose their sense of individuality. "It's not easy," Kalina said, her voice gentle. "But we're adapting. The connection between us is growing stronger, and we're learning to work together. You might not feel in control right now, but I think that's a good thing. The more we let go, the more we'll be able to handle." John shook his head, still struggling with the idea of losing control. "I don't know. It just feels wrong. I've always been in charge of my own life. And now, it's like I can feel your thoughts, your feelings, and it's confusing." Kalina's lips twitched into the smallest of smiles. "It's strange, yes, but it's part of the process. The pathogen is forcing us to rely on each other. The more we fight it, the harder it will be. If we give in to the connection, we can use it to our advantage." John frowned, still unsure. "But if we give in too much, what happens to us? What if we lose ourselves completely?" Kalina's expression turned serious. "I don't think we'll lose ourselves. We're still human. The pathogen is changing us, yes, but it's not taking away our identities. It's enhancing us, making us stronger, more capable. Together, we can be something we could never be apart." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, John was silent. He didn't know if he could trust the alien girl, Kalina, completely. She had been a stranger to him, but now, it was like they shared something deeper than just their situation. They were linked, their thoughts and emotions intertwined by the pathogen that had infected them both. "I'm not sure about this," John said finally, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "But I don't think we have a choice. The pathogen's already affecting us, and the longer we wait, the more it's going to change us." Kalina met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. "You're right. We don't have a choice. But together, we can handle whatever comes next." John hesitated before standing up. His body still felt strange, but there was a new resolve in his movements. "All right," he said. "Let's do this. We'll work together, as long as we're both on the same page." Kalina stood as well, her posture fluid and graceful. She extended her hand to him, her eyes steady. Together. John stared at her hand for a moment before reaching out and shaking it. As their palms met, he felt a strange warmth spread through his body. It wasn't just physical warmth, it was something deeper. The connection between them flared, a pulse that sent a jolt of energy through him. It was like an unspoken promise, an understanding that they were in this together, no matter what. As they pulled back, John's mind raced. He could feel Kalina's emotions more clearly now, her thoughts no longer just an echo, but a faint whisper in the back of his mind. She was nervous, but she was also hopeful. He could sense her strength, her determination to keep going. And in that moment, he realized something. He wasn't alone. Even though everything around him had changed, even though his body and mind felt like they were no longer his own, Kalina was with him. And together, they would figure this out. So, John said, his voice more confident now, "What's the next step?" Kalina tilted her head, considering. "We need to keep working together. The pathogen is still adapting to us. But if we synchronize our thoughts more, we might be able to understand it better. And once we do, we can control it." John nodded, feeling a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could take control of the situation. But as he looked at Kalina, he knew there was still so much they didn't understand about what was happening to them. The only thing he was sure of now was that they were no longer just two strangers. They were something more, and that connection was the key to surviving. The days in the quarantine chamber blurred together, each one feeling both endless and fleeting at the same time. John and Kalina had grown more attuned to each other, their connection becoming deeper with each passing moment. It was no longer just about surviving the pathogen. It was about learning how to live with it, how to understand it. Their minds were linked in ways that John could never have imagined. It was like they were two pieces of a puzzle that had been forced together, each of them incomplete without the other. Kalina's thoughts and emotions were no longer distant echoes in his mind. They were clear, vibrant, and real. He could feel her when she was near, her presence as palpable as the air he breathed. But it wasn't just her. He could feel the pathogen too, in a way. Its influence had grown stronger, pushing them to rely on each other more, to share their thoughts, their fears, their hopes. And in some strange way, it had started to make them more efficient. Their movements were synchronized, their decisions quicker, more instinctive. It was as if they were becoming one entity, a singular force, instead of two individuals. John wasn't sure how he felt about that. There were moments when it felt like an incredible strength, like they could take on the world together. But other times it felt suffocating, as if the pathogen was pushing them to be something they weren't. Something alien. Kalina seemed to sense his unease. She had been quieter lately, more introspective, and John couldn't help but wonder what was going on in her mind. She had always been calm, collected, but now she seemed distracted. He didn't know if it was the pathogen or something else that was causing her to pull away. "Kalina," John said one evening, breaking the silence that had settled between them. "You've been quiet lately. Is something bothering you?" She looked up from the small console she had been working on, her violet eyes locking onto his. For a moment, she didn't say anything, as if considering whether or not to answer. Then she spoke, her voice softer than usual. "I've been thinking," she said slowly, her gaze drifting to the floor, "about the pathogen. It's different than I thought." John furrowed his brow. "What do you mean?" "I thought it was just trying to bond with us." "It's more than that," Kalina continued. "The pathogen isn't just merging with our biology. It's merging with our very consciousness. And it's not just making us more connected, it's changing us. I'm not sure if we're in control anymore." John's stomach tightened at her words. "So, what, we're just becoming part of it? Part of something we don't even understand?" Kalina nodded, her face serious. "Yes, it's not just about survival anymore. The pathogen has its own agenda. It's using us to evolve, to spread. And I'm starting to wonder if it's using our connection to manipulate us. The thought sent a cold shiver down John's spine. He had always trusted Kalina, but now, with the doubts creeping into her voice, he wasn't so sure anymore. Was the pathogen controlling them in ways they couldn't see? Were they just puppets being pulled along by an unseen force? I don't know if I can keep going like this, John said, his voice shaking slightly. The more I feel connected to you, the more I feel like I'm losing myself. Like I'm not me anymore. Kalina's expression softened, and she moved closer to him. John, I understand. I feel the same way. But we can't stop now. We need to find a way to use this connection, to understand the pathogen before it completely takes control of us. John met her gaze, his heart racing. He wanted to believe her, to trust that they could still control their fate. But the more he thought about it, the more the truth became clear. They were running out of time. The pathogen was changing them, and they didn't fully understand how or why. Every decision, every step they took seemed to bring them closer to a point of no return. I think we need to get out of here, John said suddenly. If we stay in this chamber much longer, we'll be completely under its influence. We need to find a way to stop it before it's too late. Kalina looked at him, her eyes narrowing as she thought about his words. You're right, she said after a long pause. But we don't know what's out there. We don't even know if we can trust anyone outside this chamber. John ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Then we'll have to take that risk. We have to move, Kalina. We can't wait for someone else to fix this. We have to fix it ourselves. Kalina stood in silence for a moment, her thoughts clearly racing. Then, with a deep breath, she nodded. All right, we'll leave. But we need a plan. We need to understand more about the pathogen, about what it's doing to us. John nodded in agreement. They had no choice but to leave the safety of the quarantine chamber and face whatever lay beyond. But as he looked at Kalina, he couldn't help but wonder if the connection between them was something they could escape, or if, like the pathogen itself, it would follow them wherever they went. The future felt uncertain, full of dangers they couldn't yet comprehend. But they had no choice but to move forward. Together, John and Kalina stood by the door of the quarantine chamber, the weight of their decision pressing heavily on their shoulders. Outside the door lay an uncertain future, a world that might be full of dangers they couldn't predict, a world that might no longer be safe. But they knew they had no choice. The pathogen had changed everything. And staying where they were, trapped in this small room, would only make things worse. We have to move quickly, John said, his voice low but steady. If the pathogen is controlling us, it's only a matter of time before it takes full control. We need to find a way to stop it. Kalina nodded, her violet eyes filled with determination. I agree. We've learned enough to know that we can't wait. The connection between us is getting stronger, and we don't know how much longer we can resist it. We need to act now. With one last look at the small chamber that had been their prison, they stepped through the door. The corridor outside was dimly lit, the walls cold and sterile. It was eerily quiet, and the air felt thick with tension. John could feel the weight of the pathogen inside him, its influence trying to pull him back. But he forced himself to focus. He had to keep moving forward. The two of them walked side by side, the silence between them filled with the unspoken knowledge that they were in this together. Their connection had grown stronger with each passing day, and now, it was as if their thoughts were no longer separate. It wasn't just a feeling. John could almost hear Kalina's thoughts in his mind, clear and distinct. It was unsettling, but it also gave him a sense of solidarity. She was with him, and that made all the difference. Where do we go now? John asked, his voice echoing slightly in the empty hall. We don't have any answers, no real plan. We're just guessing at this point. Kalina paused, her brow furrowing as she considered his question. We need to find out more about the pathogen. If we can learn where it came from, maybe we can figure out how to stop it. There's a research facility nearby. If we can get there, we might be able to find the answers we need. John felt a spark of hope at her words. A research facility. If anyone had the knowledge to understand the pathogen, it would be the scientists there. But getting to it wouldn't be easy. They didn't know what obstacles lay between them and the facility, or if anyone would even be there. The entire world had changed, and they were venturing into unknown territory. "We'll need to be careful," John said, his voice firm. "If there's anyone left out there, they might not be friendly. We've seen what this pathogen can do. It's not just a virus. It's something far worse." "I know," Kaylina replied, her voice calm but serious. "But we don't have time to be cautious. The longer we wait, the stronger the pathogen's influence will become. We have to take the risk." John hesitated for a moment, but then he nodded. He trusted Kaylina. Together, they had learned to survive. Together, they could face whatever came next. The two of them moved down the corridor, every step taking them further from the safety they had once known. As they walked, John couldn't help but notice how the connection between them had changed. It wasn't just a mental link anymore. It felt like their very bodies were in sync, their movements almost mirrored. It was strange, but at the same time, it felt natural. The pathogen had made them more than they had ever been alone. It had bonded them in ways that were hard to describe. "Do you feel that?" Kaylina asked suddenly, her voice barely a whisper. John stopped in his tracks, his senses alert. "What?" "The pathogen," Kaylina said, her eyes wide. "It's getting stronger. I can feel it, pulling at us, trying to influence us. It's like it's reacting to our movement." John's heart raced. He could feel it too. The pressure building in his chest, the strange pull inside his mind. The pathogen wasn't just in them anymore. It was surrounding them, watching them, waiting. "We need to hurry," John said urgently, his eyes scanning the corridor ahead. "We're running out of time." They quickened their pace, moving as fast as they could without drawing attention to themselves. The further they went, the more intense the feeling became. It was as if the pathogen was trying to track them, to stop them from escaping. They couldn't let that happen. As they reached the end of the corridor, they came to a set of heavy doors. The research facility was just beyond it, but they could see no sign of life. The place seemed abandoned, as if everyone had vanished without a trace. Kaylina stepped forward, her fingers brushing over the door's control panel. "This is it," she said, her voice steady. "We'll find answers here. We just have to be careful." John nodded, his mind racing with 100 questions. What had happened to the people who worked here? Had they left in a hurry, or had they fallen to the pathogen like so many others? The answers were just beyond the door, but as they stepped forward, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far bigger than they could understand. With a soft beep, the door slid open, and they stepped into the unknown.